Today, we're going to be talking about family businesses.
Most of what we see in the media is the downside of familial connection in business and all the things that can go terribly, horribly wrong when we get into commercial relationships with our loved ones and our blood relatives. But the reality is that family capitalism is a dominant form of capitalism around the world.
For the individual that is in a family business, what is the next thing they could do to start to commence a pathway to building an enduring family enterprise?
When a crisis inevitably strikes and the frequency and intensity of those crises is increasing, which is unfamiliar to those in advanced economies, but painfully familiar to those in emerging and frontier economies, it's absolutely essential that we.
Devin, good morning and welcome to the Ultra Growth Podcast. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much, RJ, for having me on the show.
Absolutely, absolutely. So today we're going to be talking about family businesses, and it's a fascinating subject. And to be honest, I don't watch a lot of TV, but the dramas and sagas that I do watch are generally geared around family dynasties and the dynamics. Obviously, we had the show Succession, which I think was loosely based on Rupert Murdoch. That's the rumor, and that was a fascinating show. And all the drama and the complexity, and you've decided to write a book about it. Now, why and what inspired you to do that?
It's a great observation. Most of what we see in the media is the downside of familial connection in business and all the things that can go terribly, horribly wrong when we get into commercial relationships with our loved ones and our blood relatives. But the reality is that family capitalism is a dominant form of capitalism around the world. That family business represents something like 70 to 90% of all economic activity, employment, R&D, capex, and so forth in most countries around the world. And Yvonne and I have been students of these family businesses for decades. Yvonne and several of his colleagues in the 80s and 90s were among the founding fathers and mothers of the field who established family business as a domain distinct from the general management science because there really hadn't been much written about it beyond entrepreneurship. And the two of us have been teaching and consulting and studying family businesses around the world for the better part of 20 years now. So we actually wrote this book to capture some of our lessons learned from all of that activity, and in particular to frame a counterintuitive notion, which is that all businesses, big and small, who are operating in the world's most advanced economies, they're companies that are often considered to be the gold standard in terms of organizational excellence, actually have a lot to learn from family businesses, and in particular, those family businesses that operate in emerging and frontier economies because of how resilient they are at overcoming decades of turmoil and still managing not only to survive, but actually to thrive.
So in the book that you and Yvonne have written, The Enduring Enterprise, what are your kind of personal experiences or key observations that have shaped the core themes of the book?
Yeah, great question. The structure of the book itself is based around the core themes. And the first is that anyone in virtually any country right now following virtually any form of news these days could tell you that we seem to be coming to the end of a long period of peace and stability, one that lasted nearly a century, and that some new age of uncertainty, as we like to call it, is just beginning. So that's the founding premise of this, is that we are heading into a set of operating conditions that will be wholly unfamiliar to most people who have been born and raised in the developed West. The second premise, yeah.
Why is that? Is that because of AI and technology?
No, it's a confluence of factors. In fact, there's a whole kickoff to one of the chapters where we talk about polycrisis, this construct where a variety of interacting factors are cascading their way through the modern global economy that is causing the tectonic plates under which civilization is perched to begin to creak in ways that are unfamiliar to anybody who maybe wasn't around in anything other than the Second World War or the Great Depression. And there are fewer and fewer human beings alive today who can have a firsthand understanding of what it was like to live through those trying times. But it feels like a combination of technological disruption, of demographic trends. These are slow moving trends, of course, of social justice and social turmoil and conflict, of market failures, and increasingly of climate change. These, again, slow moving tectonic forces that are combining to create an environment that is becoming much harder to predict and yet increasingly complex. And the combination of those factors makes decision making a lot more difficult and, frankly, challenges us to reconsider our intuition as to how we design our businesses and lead and craft strategy, because we can no longer presume that that next year will look an awful lot like this year or last year, which is, again, one of the reasons why we look to emerging and frontier economies for inspiration, because they're used to living that way. That the long term, when you're planning and leading a large business in Venezuela, is 3 months, not 3 years. And that's if you're lucky. It could be as short as 3 weeks. And that's similar for the families that are operating in Syria that we studied, or in Ukraine that we studied, or in parts of Africa or parts of East Asia, places where turmoil is endemic. And therefore, we have our planning horizons are brought much closer to the present.
Do you think that, and I'll let you continue to answer the question around the key themes of the book, but this is really interesting. Do you feel that in Western countries the same capacity for disruption and positive or negative trends are there to the extent that it is in an emerging market or a developing market? Like, is that actually, how did you guys determine that was a relevant baseline for countries in the West? Because I would argue that countries in the West are potentially operating within a more stable environment.
We argue the same thing, that historically they have been operating in a more stable environment, which is precisely why they have further to fall, so to speak. Why the changing conditions will be so much more unfamiliar and disruptive in those environments than they will be in places where regime change and currency crises and trade wars and tariff, sort of turmoil is a seasonal occurrence, if not a monthly or weekly occurrence, as opposed to something that happens once in a career or once in a lifetime.
Why don't you continue to run us through the core themes of the
With pleasure, RJ. The second major theme in the book is that exposure to chronic uncertainty, if you will, that accompanies moments like this, the ones we're experiencing in the advanced West, but which are endemic to these other places, can be devastating to conventional business models if you're not prepared for them. But they these models, because they reward stability and predictability, are not necessarily fit for purpose any longer. But under the right conditions, uncertainty can also boost organizational adaptability and performance. And we lay out some of those conditions. The basic concept that resistance breeds resilience, if you will. It's like stressing out your muscles, lifting heavy weights and tearing them in order to make them stronger. And in some respects, the same can be said for human beings, for communities, certainly for organizations and institutions. A third premise is that in our experience, the family businesses who operate successfully in these environments, and the ones that have done so for decades and even centuries, have actually developed a portfolio of stabilizing strategies. We identify 7 of them in the book, but these are very replicable. We found them across industries and across geographies, and more or less in the absence of external stability, these organizations have decided to, either by choice or by force or by accident, to invest internally in stability. And these investments have really helped them to survive and thrive in the face of chronic turbulence.
Reviewing and researching all these family businesses, what are some of the key competitive advantages that you found these companies have that could potentially become a vulnerability for these companies?
Sure. Well, when you're framing the families themselves as a unique source of stability, the it's both a feature and a bug of these systems, if you will. On the one hand, they work well, or when they work well, they can represent an inherent and an instinctive source of trust, right? So in the absence of trust in these environments, when chaos reigns and we can no longer necessarily trust third parties or the government or the media and so forth, all of this sort of decline in trust, well, we tend to instinctively trust more intuitively our family and extended networks of friends that our family knows well. These tribal allegiances are really hardwired into our ancient brains. So again, it comes quite naturally. But families themselves are also, because they're intergenerational by their very nature, inclined to focus on longer term performance, which requires them both to chase the upside like most businesses, but in particular to protect against the downside. And on balance, we found that the enduring enterprises tend to emphasize more uh, preventing losses and preventing failure than they do at chasing extreme growth, if you will. And that perspective shapes their planning horizons. It shapes their risk tolerance. They become highly concerned with quality, with building humane cultures within their companies, investing in their communities, and that helps them both to achieve a level of growth as a byproduct of that over time, particularly if conditions are favorable, but also protects them in the case that things go sideways in ways that companies that haven't made those investments aren't able to capitalize on. They also have a really amazing capacity to build an institutional memory and a transfer of knowledge about the last time a crisis struck. And they share that wisdom on how to successfully navigate, across the dinner table or at the knee of the grandparent and so forth. So this sense of the last time this happened, we did X and Y and Z. We have a playbook, and it's not necessarily one that we got in our Western business school, but it's one that I've inherited from my family. The last time we had a coup d'état, or the last time that we couldn't get access to dollars, or the last time that our one of our businesses was expropriated, or so forth. These things, just have to make it up as you go along. You can actually tap this long lineage of institutional memory that isn't necessarily captured in non-family systems.
That's interesting, Devin. Like, I think that's a really good point around the tie-in when operators of a business have an interlink with their identity with that business. And I suppose the decision making that comes when you feel like your personal credibility, your integrity, the name of your family is associated with the business, right? Like, that's a secret sauce. But I suppose on the flip side, that can get murky because you have a lot of emotions and you've got a lot of fire in the belly, so to speak, when decisions are getting made, right?
That's right. Your emotional commitment to a place, a business, a customer, and so forth can be an incredible driver of resilience, in the sense that it keeps you there maybe longer than others might be comfortable with. And you see that constantly, especially in emerging and frontier economies, where Western multinationals will enter the country in the hopes of building a new market, but be among the first to leave at the signs of distress. Whereas the families who are born and raised there and have deep commitments to the communities and so forth are the ones that end up staying the course. So that's really terrific. On the flip side, of course, that emotional connection to place can leave you in certain circumstances holding on a little longer than is prudent, and knowing when to hold them and when to fold them is a big part of the art and science of building an enduring enterprise.
It sounded like a song there, Devin. Uh, a quick one. Governance, leadership, and succession. And I know that's a massive, massive topic, Devin, but how does successful, enduring enterprise, family based businesses look at that stuff? Like, how do they deal with that stuff?
It's a great question. In fact, every enduring enterprise needs to get this stuff right, or it has virtually no chance at generational success. The transfer of leadership, of ownership, of stewardship and values and culture in an organization is among the most important responsibilities of the leading generation. And in a family that's committed to multi-generational success, preparing the next generation sufficiently and with enough time, and providing optionality to the extent that you don't want to put all your eggs in one basket, so to speak, in terms of the next generation, and make sure you've got diversity of talent and so forth, is absolutely essential. And irrespective of what's happening in the world, we may be in a moment of turmoil or not. This is these are internal risks over which we have a considerable amount of control. And so it's up to us to decide what our governance system will be, to the extent that we're not in a regulated business, of course, and to choose who our leaders will be, and to choose when we want to transition those leaders. And it's the biggest unforced error in business to not attend to these risks of the transfer of power and leadership over time in a thoughtful and pragmatic way. What the best businesses and families that we work with do is get proactive about that. They don't wait until a current leader, our group of leaders have to face a traumatic health event, the unexpected loss of a leader, and then have to scramble in a crisis to backfill for that person. They don't wait until a governance system is so unfit for purpose that bad decisions are being made about the enterprise, and then have to rush to reach back in and fix it and tweak it. They don't wait until leadership has manifested such a string of bad choices, that it becomes quite problematic to extricate them from that situation and to try to right the ship. The tone at the top does set culture up for quite some time, and the half-life of the influence of a leader can materially affect culture for quite some time. So you don't want to wait until problems surface. You want to anticipate. You want to look around the corner. And the most enduring enterprises we know, whether they're in advanced markets or in some of the world's most complicated and challenging operating environments, get out ahead of these issues as far as possible. You don't have to start doing this when your leaders are in their 40s and their kids are in their diapers. But you certainly don't want to wait until your leaders are in their diapers, so to speak, and at that point are really struggling to ensure that there is continuity built into the upper echelons of the organization.
Generally speaking, Devin, with companies that you've dealt with and researched that are multi-generational, do they generally have, I suppose it might be a mix of external CEOs, or are they generally part of the family? And from a board perspective, what's the ratio or what's the dynamic of like family based board members versus non-execs? And because I would imagine, particularly at a board level, there'd be a lot of businesses, family businesses, that have family members on the board that aren't necessarily operating within the business. Some of them may not even be commercial people. Like, do they have advisors? Like, is that the wise thing to do? I'm just trying to understand the composition of, at a real general sense, boards and the CEO being in the family or not. Like, what have you typically seen?
Well, as you can imagine, we've seen a broad array of configurations of this, from families that emphasize family involvement directly in operations. It's as many family members as we can possibly, fit into the business. This goes back to the Rothschilds and their early, sort of building of a commercial and financial empire. And they recruited as many family members as they could to manage the disparate parts of the enterprise, in-laws, kids, and so forth, because trust was inherent to those relationships, and therefore made it a lot easier to conduct business seamlessly across vast distances and with not all that great communication technology at the time. But as you can imagine, for most businesses, there will be a question at some point of engaging non-family leaders. If you're lucky enough to grow large enough that, even if you took every single family member you had and they were all highly competent, you put them into the business, you're still going to need other people to help you continue to scale and grow. And at that point, it's really critical to make sure that the folks that you're bringing in are aligned with you in terms of your vision for the enterprise, are aligned in terms of the core values that drive why they're getting involved in this work. And at that point, you can pursue what we like to call sometimes nepotism with excellence, which is to the extent that there are family members who are well suited to particular roles within the business. Of course, you'll want to engage them because there's nothing quite like a family member who's ready and willing and capable of rolling up their sleeves to lead by example, would be the first one to arrive in the morning and the last one to leave at night, and always going the extra mile. It really does send a powerful signal to non-family members that the family is deeply committed to the business. That said, there are family members and families that choose to engage, employees who are a member of the founding tribe, who don't necessarily share that work ethos and are just holding a corner office and get a business card with special projects manager on it or something along those lines. We find a home for them somewhere here because they can't necessarily find a job elsewhere. And that, of course, can be problematic. And that's just within operations. So you were asking both about operations and at the board level. At the end of the day, we've got to recognize that family members have an opportunity to send a very powerful signal into the business if they're working in the business, that this enterprise still matters to the family. And therefore, if I'm going to build my career in this business, it's reassuring to me potentially to see a hardworking family member here. It's not a source of competition necessarily. It's actually an asset. And that's an important demarcation of maturity of a business, that it can acknowledge that its family members can actually be contributing value-added members. At the board level, it's a little bit different. To your point, is somebody might have taken a fundamentally different path that doesn't have any commercial background. They didn't go to business school. They didn't work in business. They may be an artist. They may be a research scientist. They could be, a writer. And some of the most effective board directors that we've ever met have come from outside of the business, but are able to deploy their logic and their problem-solving skills, as well as their deep understanding of the family's vision and values, so that when they're deliberating around important decisions, especially the most important decisions that can affect a business, for instance, transformational transactions like the selling of a legacy business or the merger with a rival that may not share our values, even if it's deeply lucrative, or the launching of a new product that runs against the grain of our core ethos as an organization, and maybe incredibly profitable, but doesn't sit right with the family for a variety of reasons. That's where a family director who isn't necessarily involved in the business, but can get trained up enough to understand the business implications, can really add a lot of value, even if you're in a room of non-family directors with a bunch of independent directors who bring transactional experience, who bring operating experience, who bring leadership experience, and so forth. That it's that connection to the family's values that none of those other individuals have beyond their technical capabilities, that can ensure that the board is ultimately making the right decision, so to speak, in that moment, and not being wooed or seduced to make a decision simply because the financials make sense.
And I would imagine one of the risks for family run business, particularly at a board level, is, if you have a patriarch or matriarch that's, brought on a lot of his or her friends, decisions may be getting made prior to even going into the board, and it could just be a farce, right? Like, so I think like having a board that actually is operating as it should be, right? With the right principles and the right directives and the right forms of communication, I would imagine is important and would require some levels of discipline. Yeah.
Absolutely, RJ. You hit the nail on the head here. In terms of board efficacy, ultimately, the composition of that board matters as much as its mandate and authority within the system. And if, which is often the case in new boards that are being established by founders as opposed to, more institutional boards, the desire first is to resist the board. Often right out of the gates. Why do I need somebody above me to hold me accountable when I hold all the cards, I own the business, I'm leading the business, it's my idea. So all of this is superfluous. In fact, if anything, it's expensive and unnecessary and slows me down. There are a variety of reasons why we talk to these founders and suggest that if for no other reason than as a form of contingency planning, they ought to contemplate having a board in place. That tends to at least begin to open up the possibility of them thinking about this organ of governance as being complementary to their leadership and allowing them to have a sounding board for some of these ideas. But a sounding board isn't necessarily an echo chamber. And the whole reason that you would be bringing these people into a room is so that they can speak truth to power. And if all you have is a bunch of ultimate supporters, people who are there to rubber stamp or to just, sort of collect a paycheck, or are there for the social benefits of saying I'm on so and so's board, then you're not really getting the most out of that board. In fact, it's just a social gathering. What you want out of a robust board is robust deliberation, is strategic debate, is asking great questions that the executive team and isn't asking themselves. And that's something that we work with families to ensure when they're establishing a board or renovating their board, that they recognize just how much value a board that challenges you can be, even if it's uncomfortable in the moment. It often allows you to get to better decision making, which is ultimately one of the primary functions of a board like that.
Devin, you brought up an interesting point. Like an entrepreneur that's built a business will typically have a high opinion of themselves, be really strong characters. I think it's safe to assume their initial desire to create a board, I would say, isn't natural, right? Because they're used to kind of making decisions and doing things the way they want to. In your experience, their move to generally create a board, is that driven out of like the desire to potentially attract finance, funding, like, or are they generally motivated by altruistic motives of like, better governance and, having more opinions? And like, what actually would drive someone who's used to absolute control to actually want to put a potential whip to their own back?
It's a terrific framing, RJ. I'm reminded now of one of the very earliest family business consultants, Niccolo Machiavelli, who would describe that power is never given; it's always taken. And I think in this context, the founder's mindset is one of control. And in our experience, there are founders who understand the preemptive benefits of building out a board, the strategic benefits of it, but also in terms of preparing and inducting the next generation and giving them an opportunity to participate in observation of decision making and then ultimately participate directly. Boards can be terrific vehicles for that. But the proportion of controlling owners, as we describe them, who take that proactive approach, I'd say they would be in the minority if you looked at the distribution of all the families that we've worked with, and we've worked, of course, with hundreds over the decades. That the more common reaction to the possibility or the prospect of a board is resistance, and it's resistance for the reasons that you described and we've already discussed. Unless, of course, as you say, they're looking for capital, and in those contexts, setting up governance can become one of the criteria for gaining access to that capital. Or obviously, when going public, all of that governance is imposed upon you by regulatory decree. The opportunity that we share for founders who aren't or don't have that level of governance imposed upon them is that there is some wisdom to those structures. That regulatory governance, Sarbanes-Oxley isn't necessarily a recipe for efficient governance, but there are elements of that governance in terms of transparency, in terms of aggregated financials, in terms of the representativeness of that group, in terms of the frequency of meeting and the capturing of the minutes and so forth. There are elements of that can be useful for any system. And the benefit of being a privately held family controlled company is you get to pick and choose the best parts of governance that suit your system and customize a structure that works for you, that is actually value added. But we'd never advocate for governance that wasn't value added. But it's helping the founders understand that having this kind of structure can add value, which is often the most challenging piece.
Let's talk about nepotism at an operational level. Okay, so how have you seen the better companies manage reporting lines and nepotism? And does nepotism and the acceptance of it vary from culture to culture? Like, would an American context, like would an American business be less accepting of nepotism versus a family-based business in Venezuela? Right? Like, so I guess it's two questions. Like, one, how do some of the better companies manage nepotism, and does nepotism vary in terms of acceptance from society to society?
The second question is a lot easier to answer, which is that yeah, absolutely it it varies from society to society. Some cultures are naturally hierarchical and paternalistic, and frankly, the history of nepotism goes back centuries, and it is baked into the ways in which our family construct has evolved over time, and how capitalism has evolved over time. In most of Western Europe, there was always a sense that the firstborn would inherit, firstborn son actually, and there's a gendered bias obviously in this construct, would inherit the land or the business or whatever it was. The second born would be sent off to war, and the third born would join the clergy, or something along those lines. I mean, these are the muscle. This is the muscle memory of Western civilization as it relates to nepotism, and so it's only really a more modern phenomenon in which we get this sense that a business might be better led in the hands of a non-family member than a family member. And still today, in places like Japan, where for centuries the practice has been to even adopt non-family members if we don't have a natural family heir in the business, this sort of cultural phenomenon is quite critical. But most importantly, in order to make nepotism work, to have nepotism with excellence, to the extent that that is possible, involves a couple of things. And you mentioned one of them, reporting. To the extent that you have two family members working within a business, it's often best not to have, for instance, kids reporting directly to their parents, and to have at least one layer of bureaucracy, if you will, or one layer of management between them. So to have direct reporting to a non-family member. Now, of course, that puts that non-family member in a really awkward position where they have to give critical, honest feedback to a family member whose parent is their boss ultimately. And so making sure that you give them the leeway and the protection to give honest feedback and constructive feedback is a big part of setting that up. Additionally, you can get into an issue of what we call a sort of the governance sandwich, which is that a family member who's working in the business for a non-family CEO may be, sort of mid-level manager, but if they're also sitting on the board of that company, then they are simultaneously a direct report of the executive and ultimately the sort of boss of that chief executive. And that's not usually a particularly functional construct, as you can imagine, for a variety of reasons. The other thought as it relates to bringing family members into the business, and nepotism has this bad name. It's got a connotation associated with it, but governing owners can be, or I should say, operating owners can be incredibly value added for all the reasons that we just discussed. And that ideally, to make this work, what you want to do is create a meritocratic environment. In some cases, families even go so far as to create a culture of reverse nepotism, wherein family members have to jump through even more hoops in order to be able to get a job in the business than non-family members. The expectations for the degrees and the credentials before they come in are higher. For others, it might be a bachelor's degree. For them, it might be a master's or a PhD or what have you. They will expect a higher work ethic for family members who are working within the business. They will ensure that there's no favoritism and that they have to start from the ground up, sweeping floors in the factory and moving their way through the business if they want to work their way all the way through the structure. And to the extent possible, they try to set up a situation in which you're not, especially if there are multiple family members who are interested in this path, not creating a tournament to the top of the organization. So you have internecine sort of infighting within the family for those senior level positions to make sure that everybody is being, has a career path that is well suited to them, but also most importantly beneficial to the business itself. And that to the extent possible, you can suppress any sense of this being a battle to the death, so to speak, for the leadership of the enterprise longer term. A Game of Thrones moment, if you will.
Yeah. This is now an opinion. I want to ask your opinion on this. Do you think that it is healthy or not in terms of the development of leaders within the family for them to go work externally for some time?
In general, what we see and what we advocate for is spending at least a little bit of time, if not a substantial amount of time, outside of the family business for a couple of very logical reasons. One is, if you've only ever been in school and then you go straight into your family business, you never will have known another institutional context. And so your assumptions about the range of possibility will be narrowed simply because you'll only have ever known one ecosystem. You need to go try all the rides at the, or at least multiple rides at the carnival before you pick your favorite. And you may find, in fact, that if you let family members pursue careers outside of the business or even force them to, that they don't come back. That is a real risk, that they find something that they like more and decide not to ever come back into the business. But it helps family members level up in a bunch of important ways. It helps them build maturity outside of the business to get objective feedback on their performance from non-family members who are going to, treat them just like any other employee in that other company. It allows them in many ways to make their early mistakes, their early career mistakes in an enterprise that isn't their own, and that legacy will not follow them back into the business, but also that the lessons learned will follow them back into the business. And of course, to the extent possible that you can find a complementary and transferable skill set, that the experience that you get in these other businesses can actually be leveraged to support the family enterprise in some meaningful way. So for all of those reasons, spending at least 2 to 5 years is the typical range that we see in many of the families that we support. That amount of time outside of the family business before first joining, in addition to a degree that is relevant to doing what they would be doing within the business, is often table stakes for their entry.
And I think this is a tricky question. So again, Devin, I'm throwing some curly ones at you because I know that there's such a range of answers, but I mean, I could talk about this for hours, right? So I'm trying to jam pack and ask you some broad questions, but how do some of the better run family businesses prevent issues from going from the boardroom or operations to the family room and kitchen table? Like what the politicking and how do they manage that?
Yeah, to be able to separate the church and state, the rational, pragmatic, and financial and strategic consequential decisions that they will make together as a family, from the emotional connections that they've nurtured, obviously from birth, and which can, in fact, in many cases, intrude upon their capacity to have those conversations effectively in business. It works both ways. You can have transference of this emotional construct from the business into one's home, and you bring those troubles home with you, and that can often tear families apart. But similarly, sibling dysfunction and rivalry can manifest itself in a business, even a business that's working incredibly well, in ways that aren't particularly constructive. So families that are successful at compartmentalizing this, if you will, have a map of their family system in mind. They understand that every family enterprise is really made up of 3 subdomains. the domain of business or operations, the domain of ownership, and a whole bunch of questions and issues related to ownership, and the domain of family. And of course, in this Venn diagram, these three circles are overlapping. And in certain places, all three overlap, and in other places, only two of the three overlap. But mapping out their family enterprise, understanding where in the system they are based, and then recognizing that at any given moment, they may be wearing a family hat, an ownership hat, or a business hat, so to speak, is really helpful, because there's a wonderful anecdote from one of our clients a number of years ago, where a father had to fire his son. Essentially, he wasn't performing well in the business. He was considered to be an heir apparent to this enterprise, but his heart wasn't necessarily in it, and he wasn't, as a byproduct of that, particularly good as a manager. And so, the father invites the son into his office, and he says, "Come on and sit down here, son." He says, "First, I'm going to put on my CEO hat." And he says, "Son, I'm sorry to inform you that you've been fired." And then he switches his hat and he says, "Okay, now, son, I've got my dad hat on now. I understand that you've just been fired. Let's talk about what this means and how many new opportunities you have to pursue all the stuff that I know deep in your heart that you've really wanted to pursue, but have been trapped here because I've forced you into this construct of working here, which was my dream, but I know it's not yours, you know?" So just being able to dance between those and recognize that in a family business, we're wearing multiple hats, and we have to know, when a conversation is being guided by us wearing one of those hats, or taking a conversation from the perspective of a particular stakeholder. We have to understand when we're moving into a new domain and where we need a new vocabulary in many cases, or a new level of understanding or empathy, in order to be able to connect with the very same people, but in a different and still productive way.
All right, I'm going to ask you a final question, Devin. For the individual that is in a family business that reads your book, listens to this interview, and I have some people I mentor in that situation, so they're going to be listening. What is the next thing they could do to start to commence a pathway to building an enduring family enterprise?
Well, I think it's a great question, RJ. I think just asking the question is the first step to being curious about what it takes to build an enduring enterprise. And of course, we've got a whole book that lays it out. But let me give you three sort of pithy ideas that I think are the cornerstones of an enduring enterprise. And they are the following. The first is this idea that we need to be more proactive in our planning. And that's anticipatory, right? Where, as we talked about, whether it's related to governance or succession planning, or any of the macro trends and shifts that are happening out there in the world, tech disruption and so forth, our ability to anticipate and respond quickly to these threats is going to be a very significant driver of our long-term performance. One. Two, when a crisis inevitably strikes and the frequency and intensity of those crises is increasing, which is unfamiliar to those in advanced economies, but painfully familiar to those in emerging and frontier economies, it's absolutely essential that we respond adaptively, that we find ways of limiting the damage when these threats arrive, and then navigate with confidence through the turmoil, recognizing that at some point things will stabilize, but often that journey is more of a marathon than a sprint. So not to expect that the COVID-19 pandemic was going to resolve itself in a couple of months, but recognizing that this was a step change in the ways in which our businesses and societies were being organized, at least for several years, and that we really haven't been able to snap back to the way things were before. That connects to this third idea of enhanced recovery, or bouncing back better, as is sometimes described. And that's finding ways, as crisis conditions subside, to resume operations quickly and even pursue growth as crisis subsides. In fact, there are many folks, and Warren Buffett's got a great quote, something along the lines of, every decade or so, on the horizon, dark clouds will form, but the silver lining is in those moments, we ought to rush outside, not with teaspoons, but bathtubs, because tremendous opportunity tends to emerge in the wake of these crises, as those companies that have failed will be available on fire sale prices, as new markets may open up to us to the extent that we're open to the possibilities of thinking about them. So making sure that we have a path towards accelerated recovery is a very strong determinant of long-term outperformance. It's a combination of those things: proactive planning, adaptive response, and enhanced recovery are the magic combination to achieve a truly enduring enterprise.
Great answer, Devin. Where can our audience learn more about yourself and Ivan in the book?
You can find the book pretty much anywhere, audiobook and all the major retailers. You can find information about us at lga.global, where we do all of our work with enterprising families around the world. And you can connect with me on LinkedIn. You should be able to find me there, although I'm not particularly attentive to social media, I must say, but we'll happily connect with anybody who reaches out through that channel.
Thank you so much, Devin.
Thank you so much for having me, RJ. This was great.